Period 6 goes from the end of the American Civil War in 1865 all the way up really to the turn of the 20th century in 1898. Essentially, period 6 is the late 1800s. There's only two chapters here, and the first one, America's Gilded Age, deals with a core characteristic of America in the late 1800s, and that is the rapid industrialization of the era and the kind of superficial wealth that it creates for a few, while beneath those few, you have an enormous population of people who are struggling in this new industrial economy. Now, the term Gilded Age is pretty instructive. It was coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in their book of the same name as a derisive or derogatory term for the era. Gilded means that something is covered in a thin layer of gold. Thus, the Gilded Age suggests that the surface is hiding or covering a core that has little or no real value. So, to extend this metaphor here, all this means is that the Gilded Age is a period of American history that has a booming economy that is creating wealth for some, and that's what people see kind of on the surface or on the outside. And then beneath that, we have rampant poverty of the working class, we have widespread government corruption, and deep seated racism. So, first, what factors combined to make the United States a mature industrial society after the Civil War? So, the United States experienced rapid industrialization during and after the Civil War. Much of this industrialization, by the way, as you would expect, doesn't affect the South. But in the places like the Northeast and around the Great Lakes, and to a certain extent the West, with this industrialization, it means that by the time we get to 1913, the United States is producing one third of all the world's manufactured goods. During this industrialization, a lot of people moved from the countryside to cities like New York or Chicago to work in factory jobs. And this includes about 25 million immigrants entering the United States over the course of a couple of decades. This second big wave of immigration in American history is called, or rather, these folks are called the new immigrants. Not a very original name, but the new immigrants, as opposed to, I guess, the old ones from Ireland and Germany, these new ones are coming predominantly from Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Italy, Greece, Russia, Poland, and so on. We will look at them more later and understand the ramifications of this immigration. But for now, it's important to understand that immigrants are making up a significant portion of this new industrial working class. As a result of people migrating from the countryside into cities and people coming from overseas to immigrate to these cities, they grew too rapidly. And that led to overcrowding, where people were living in crowded so called tenement buildings that had little sanitation, or rather, little ventilation, very poor sanitation. Um, and this combination meant it, sickness, it meant crime. Cities were essentially overcrowded, and infrastructure wasn't keeping up, and city governments weren't able to really keep up with it either for a while. Also, in order to take advantage of the industrialization, a lot of businesses began to introduce systems of scientific management, also known as Taylorism, which was meant to increase factory production and decrease labor costs by creating strict rules and time limits for the way the workplace operated. So if you've got a part-time job and you've got a couple 15-minute breaks, a half-hour lunch break, that kind of thing, that's the sort of idea here, and that's where those things actually come from, is Taylorism. But this is meant to make the industrial workplace more efficient. It also dramatically alters what work looks like for a lot of people who are used to a little bit more autonomy and freedom during or within their working lives. Also, during this period, the railroad boom continues, and railroads crisscrossing the United States create national markets for industrial goods. In fact, we had tripled the number, or rather, the mileage of tracks in the United States by 1880. The first transcontinental railroad, which had been chartered by the Republican Congress during the Civil War, was completed in 1869. And the government invested heavily in these two companies. They'll invest in other transcontinental railways later on, and that will greatly facilitate the growth of railroads in the United States. And we'll have five transcontinental railroads by the 1890s. So this makes possible the shipping of products produced in the industrial Northeast all over the country. And that will lead to the emergence of national brands. So national brands, good examples here are Ivory Soap and Quaker Oats. These are now brands that can be purchased not just locally or regionally, but across the country. And this is very much a new phenomenon. And these national brands necessitated the use of mass marketing or mass advertising. Again, another new phenomenon during this era. And these national brands could be sold in national chain stores. Some examples here are A&P grocery stores or even the Sears and Roebuck Company mail order catalog. Here you could purchase industrial goods that were produced in the Northeast or wherever, have it shipped anywhere in the country, and the catalog is full of national brands in the same way that A&P is a grocery store a grocery store that's also full of national brands. All of these things are new phenomena during this period, and they definitely illustrate how railroads and industrialization has made America, in a certain sense, a more interconnected community, or at least a more interconnected economy. Now, there's rapid business growth during this period, and companies get huge. These become national companies, even international ones. The thing is, though, business during the Gilded Age is very much characterized by ruthless business competition, which leads to the emergence of trusts and monopolies. So, a trust, as opposed to a monopoly, is when several different companies in a single industry, like, I don't know, the oil industry or the steel industry. So, everybody within the oil industry, let's say, um, all of these companies are going to be run by a single director or a board who all agree on what prices and things should be so that they control that entire industry and determine the prices and all that. A monopoly, on the other hand, is when one company effectively controls an entire industry or enough of it so that they, in every other sense of the word, do control that industry. A couple of examples here, and really these are the only two you need to know, because these two industrialists, these captains of industry or robber barons, if you don't like them, um, they practice the two basic kinds of monopolization that the test would want you to know about. So one is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was a steel baron. The man ran the Carnegie Steel Company, and he created an enormous nationwide monopoly by using the style of monopolization called vertical integration. Vertical integration is when a company controls every step of the process. They control the sources, production, and the distribution of product. Um, so I know this is Carnegie here, and the example is uh, meat packing. So maybe we should have used, Armor Meat Company or something. But anyway, note how every step of the process is controlled by one company. They have their own cattle ranches, their own slaughterhouses, their own railroad cars, warehouses, meat packing plants, delivery wagons. So they control every step of the process. That way, they don't have to pay any other company for any part of the business that they do. Now, the other example is John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is an oil baron, and he uses horizontal integration in his Standard Oil Company. The Standard Oil Company will gain control over other companies that produce the same product. So rather than controlling every step of the process, they control one. The Standard Oil Company effectively controls or buys out every oil refinery in the nation or near to it. And that means that anyone who makes use or deals with the oil industry has to do business with J.D. Rockefeller, and he can charge at that point whatever he wants. So there are a lot of companies that are practicing these techniques, or at least trying to, and there are a lot of so-called captains of industry like Carnegie or Rockefeller, which are also known as robber barons. That's the derisive term for them. Now, while people like Carnegie and Rockefeller are becoming literally the richest people in American history, and in fact, Rockefeller is the richest person to have ever lived, and that includes people today, when accounting for inflation. But these people become incredibly wealthy in a way that we've never really seen before. But while that's happening, the industrial working class, all the people that work in these companies, are economically insecure. Machines had been gradually replacing skilled artisans for some time, and that meant that work was increasingly unskilled. It didn't require any special education or any special training. So the worker becomes devalued because they're just as good potentially as anyone else off of the street. So it was very common for industrial workers, which is increasingly most of the workforce, to work long hours, and I mean 60 hours a week. They'll be paid very low wages. They're going to work in very unsafe working conditions. And there's no social safety net as we recognize it today. So they don't get any kind of retirement program or pensions. There's no injury compensation. There's no unemployment insurance. There's no state assistance for, like, something like food stamps or public housing or anything like that. So you work in terrible conditions. And if you challenge that, you could be fired, and then you have nothing to fall back on. And it doesn't help, certainly, that employers are openly hostile to unions. So any attempt to organize the workers in a way to try to negotiate with the business owner for better pay or shorter hours or safer working conditions, that's going to be met by hostility. This era also sees a greater use of child labor, and that's because the working class are so economically insecure. They really do feel the need to have the entire family contribute to that family's income. And it was not illegal to use child laborers at this time. Like I said, there's a dramatic gap between the rich and the poor. And the wealthy often engaged in something referred to as conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption was a term coined by a social scientist named Thorstein Veblen in his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. And it refers to spending money in a way to demonstrate the possession of your wealth. So you buy the finest clothes, you build a house much larger than what you actually need. So you live an extravagant lifestyle in order to show off the amount of money that you have. And this conspicuous consumption will contrast sharply with the lives of the poor working class. So if we look at, for example, Jacob Riis, he wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. If we look at How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, it shows photographs of the poor and the living conditions that they were in. So there on the right, you see a family living in a tenement building, effectively a cheaply and hastily made apartment complex where you don't necessarily have windows, you almost certainly don't have a bathroom or running water or anything like that. Um, So they live in terrible conditions compared to literally the wealthiest Americans that have ever lived. Um, One other thing about the era that I think is important to mention um, is that economic insecurity was certainly the worst among the working class, but as a nation, we were economically insecure in the sense that we went through cycles of boom and bust. The economy would expand rapidly for a few years and then contract as the market kind of corrects itself and economic bubbles burst. So the government did not get involved in any way to try to prevent those busts from happening or to try to help people recover from the symptoms of those busts. Like, again, there's no social safety net, there's no state assistance for the poor, really. Um, so this is part of that laissez-faire economics that we practiced, where the government didn't really regulate the economy, and thus they didn't really prevent economic crises, nor did they really help us recover from them. And that's hard on everyone, certainly, but it's especially hard on the working class because that meant that steady employment was rare. You could work somewhere for a while and then you expected to lose your job because of this rapid boom and bust cycle of the American economy at this time. Number two, was the Gilded Age political system effective in meeting its goals? That really kind of depends. Politics of the Gilded Age were pretty corrupt. Wealthy interests, so robber barons, monopolies, trusts, etc., exerted an awful lot of influence over Congress through campaign contributions and so on. And in doing so, they helped keep the government supportive of laissez-faire policies that benefited big business by not charging them much in the way of taxes, by not requiring them to pay their workers a minimum wage or give them an 8-hour workday or something like that. At the local level, we have a similar kind of quid pro quo. Local party machines, or political parties that effectively ran a city and controlled much of the government there, they would hand out rewards in exchange for votes and loyalty. It's part of the spoil system that got created way, way back under Jackson. So you have kind of a local spoil system, and every big American city had one. The local party machines are handing out rewards for votes. They would take bribes, they would give kickbacks for city contracts, and all these other things. And this corruption was also known as graft. But despite taking bribes for jobs or giving a contract to a certain business, understanding that they'd get a kickback of some of that money themselves, these party machines, despite all their corruption, also actually provided some social services in exchange for political support. So, at a time when the city doesn't provide garbage cleanup or firefighting services, for example, the local party machine might. And if you want to make sure that the trash gets collected out in front of your tenement, or that if your tenement catches on fire, it's going to get put out, then you better make sure everybody in your tenement is voting for that political party. The most infamous example of this is shown here, Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was the party boss, so he was the head of the party machine in New York City. It was the Democratic Party machine. It was run out of Tammany Hall. So oftentimes, Tammany or Tammany Hall is used as synonymous with the party machine of New York City. There was also widespread corruption during, or rather at the national level, and that's certainly true of the Grant administration. This includes the Credit Mobilier scandal and the Whiskey Ring scandal, both of which, in a nutshell, saw federal officials defrauding the government of millions of dollars because they're taking bribes from wealthy businesses and businessmen, um, or they are not paying the excise taxes on things. Um, Nonetheless, both defrauded the federal government of millions of dollars and were really symbolic of this era of government corruption. Now, the parties at the time were pretty closely divided, and presidents of the period were pretty unremarkable, so we don't need to spend an awful lot of time here. During this era, the government had very little power to regulate industry, and Republicans, who were mostly in control of government during this period, favored a high protective tariff to protect industry from foreign countries, while the Democrats, who were mostly Southern, opposed it. So, not a lot here has changed necessarily. Now, in the face of all this corruption, some reform was passed during this period. One is the Civil Service Act of 1883, also called the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883, and it created a merit system for most federal employees. In other words, you didn't get a federal job because you were loyal to whoever got elected president. You would get a federal job after passing a test and going through a rigorous application process to make sure that you were actually capable of performing the duties that you're going to be hired for. So it's moving away from a spoil system toward a merit system. Now, the catalyst for this change was actually the assassination of President James Garfield. Keeping this simple, he was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, um, who was a disappointed office seeker. He was a guy who admittedly was not mentally stable, but he believed that in exchange for his work on Garfield's campaign, that he was going to be rewarded with an ambassadorship. Now, when that didn't happen, he shot President Garfield, and that leads a lot of other federal elected officials to believe, oh gosh, the same could happen to me. Thus, you have the Pendleton Civil Service Act passed, but it again replaces that old spoil system that was first instituted by Jackson in the early 1800s. Another reform passed was the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC. This was passed in 1887, and it was the first federal agency that was charged with regulating the economy. And in this case, they were trying to regulate railroad rates, or the rate that railroad companies could charge to transport your stuff. It's relatively ineffective at first, but it's the first government agency that has the power to regulate business, which is going to open the door for later uh, presidents who are reformers to really strengthen that and exert a lot more government influence over companies and how they can behave. Similarly, in the sense that it is government regulation of the economy and also it doesn't work, is the 1890 passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is an anti-monopoly law. It supposedly banned combinations in restraint of trade. In other words, that means it's illegal to have a trust. It's illegal to have a monopoly. Um, it's ineffective against businesses, uh, and it was instead mostly used actually to target unions or these combinations of workers to try to organize for better conditions for themselves. Um, the Sherman Antitrust Act is thus used as a tool to target unions, claiming that they are combinations in restraint of the labor trade. So the Sherman Antitrust Act really is not used the way that it was supposed to be, but keep in mind, a lot of congressmen, a lot of federal officials are effectively in the pocket of a lot of these robber barons at the time who are funding their campaigns and helping them get reelected. Reforms in this era are also oftentimes coming from kind of the grassroots level. So in the States, there are some organizations that form in efforts to try to resist big business. And this is particularly true among Western farmers. One organization that emerges is called the Grange, and they blame railroads and banks for most of their economic problems. They're going to blame railroads for charging excessive rates to transport their grain to market, and they're going to allege that banks are charging too high of rates of interest for loans on land, tools, etc. The Grange is relatively successful, so in some states they'll manage to pass so-called Granger laws that regulate railroad freight rates. Um, but I mentioned the Grange to kind of lay the groundwork for something else that's bigger and more important later on. So the Grange is important and it's going to evolve into something bigger. So keep it in mind because it will become much more significant moving forward. Number three, how did the economic development of the Gilded Age affect American freedom? So the divide between the poor working class and wealthy industrialists contradicted traditional visions of American equality, and we had to come up with ways to try to grapple with that and justify it as a society. One way was the proposal of social Darwinism. And this was an idea that was popular among wealthy businessmen because it kind of allowed them to sleep at night. But social Darwinism is a perversion of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, his theory of natural selection. And it posited that individuals and groups were subject to the same Darwinian laws of natural selection as plants and animals were. And robber barons or captains of industry, whatever, they're going to use this to justify their ruthless business practices. They're going to use this to justify their uh, obscene wealth in the face of such rampant poverty. Um, and it's also going to justify government inaction in the face of poverty and corruption. So it social Darwinism thinks that industrial and urban problems, like poverty, are part of a natural evolutionary process that humans couldn't control, nor should they. So, because if we interfere with the natural process, we would somehow make things worse. So, hence, we maintain these laissez-faire policies, and governments continue to lack social programs for the poor. Similarly, the idea of the self-made man was popular, and there were real examples of this. Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel and vertical integration, was a immigrant and a self-made man. He had come over as a poor immigrant and rose to be one of the wealthiest men in America. But these real examples are kind of few and far between, and most Americans actually relied on fictional examples. And here we come to Horatio Alger Jr., who was a prolific writer of rags to riches stories in which a character comes from humble origins to rise to the seat of power or wealth through, their own hard work and initiative and intelligence and whatever else. And in its own way, these stories are kind of reflections of social Darwinism that says only certain people, only the fittest, only the best are going to rise up, and if you are, not as intelligent or not as hardworking or whatever, you're not going to. And this again creates this kind of idea that if you're not wealthy, or rather, let's say it this way, that if you're poor, there's something wrong with you. If you're poor, it's because you're stupid. If you're poor, it's because you're lazy. If you're poor, it's because of some perhaps genetic deficiency with you. It's not because the system is entirely rigged against you. It's not because government is only serving the interests of the wealthy. It's not because industrial conditions are awful for you and you're mistreated by your employer. No, no, no. The problem is you. And social Darwinism is going to be applied not just to um, the poor, but it's also going to be applied to racial groups and things later on. Now, labor or union demands for higher wages and an 8-hour workday, etc., were seen as threatening to the liberty of business owners. And according to social Darwinism, intervention into the economy was an overreach of government. And again, this helps to prevent government regulation of the economy for quite some time. Now, another ideology that's proposed at the time to help kind of justify or deal with this massive gap in wealth is the so-called gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth is promoted by Andrew Carnegie. It was the belief that as the guardians of society's wealth, the rich had a duty to serve society through philanthropy or, in large donations to promote education or the arts or something like that. And Carnegie, in fact, donated over $350 million to support libraries, schools, the arts, etc. And other robber barons and captains of industry will do likewise. But this is not purely altruistic, it's also a way to protect their wealth. Because by engaging in philanthropy, robber barons can say, well, if you regulate my company and drive down my profits in doing so, or if you tax me at a reasonable rate, all that's going to do is make it harder for me to provide these things to society. So it's kind of a veiled threat there that if our philanthropy is only possible because you leave us alone. If government begins to regulate us and try to rein us in any way, then this flow of money is going to stop. Finally, worth mentioning, the Supreme Court during this era mostly dealt with economic issues, and generally speaking, Supreme Court decisions during this era tended to side with big business over labor and unions. Number four, how do reformers of the period approach the problems of industrial society? So there's significant tension over the rapid expansion of the American industry and the problems that it caused, especially among the industrial working class. Members of the working class oftentimes try to organize into unions and to use strikes to try to pressure their employers to provide them shorter hours, better pay, safer working conditions, and that kind of thing. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of small strikes during this era that are mostly centered on a single business. But we have a couple of major, practically national strikes during this era that you'll need to know. The first one is called the Great Railroad Strike, or an even cooler name, in my opinion, it was called the Great Uprising. So the Great Uprising happens in 1877. It begins when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, or B&O Railroad, yeah, from Monopoly, when that railroad cut wages to its workers. Those workers went on strike to protest it, and they are joined by workers from other railroad companies down the line in solidarity with them. And it becomes the first general strike in U.S. history and it will paralyze American commerce for 45 days. Because nothing's getting moved around the country along railroads, which are our chief mode of transport. President Rutherford B. Hayes will dispatch troops, actually those same troops from the Reconstruction South that he pulled out at the Compromise of 1877, and he'll send those northward to crush the strike. And the Great Uprising is the first in a repeating pattern that we're going to see. There's going to be a large general strike, and when that threatens American commerce, when it threatens the status quo, when it threatens the wealth of the people who control society, that's when government steps in. And when government steps in, they don't step in as a neutral arbitrator, and they don't step in on the side of the workers who often have legitimate grievances. Rather, they step in on the side of big business to help put these strikes down. We see it here. We'll see it later on during the Homestead strike. We'll see it during the Pullman strike, which are the other two big ones that you need to know. But it's a pattern. We're going to see this time and again. Now, there are some large national labor unions that will also emerge during this period. The first one to know is the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor were a huge nationwide union, and they were kind of unique and idealistic, certainly for their time. So, first of all, they were inclusive. They tried to unionize people that were skilled and unskilled, men and women, native born Americans and immigrants, white, African American. So they were really trying to create a nationwide union um, with the goal to end conflict between labor and management. So they're very idealistic in what their goals are. They hope to really reshape society. They're also very aggressive in the sense that they are very willing to use strikes to try to make demands of employers to improve the lives of their workers. They'll grow rather large. Their membership will peak at about 800,000 members in 1886, but then will plummet thereafter after an event called the Haymarket Square Riot. So the Haymarket Square Riot, gosh, the Haymarket Square Riot begins with a peaceful rally to protest police violence in Haymarket Square in Chicago. The police try to force them out of the square. Somebody throws a bomb, and then the police start opening fire on the crowd. It's a terrible mess. People are certainly killed in the process. But the and at the end of the day, this riot is blamed on the Knights of Labor, and it's used as an excuse for local authorities to go after leaders of this labor movement, leaders of the Knights of Labor and the local Socialist Party. Um, and it will allow the labor movement to be painted as dangerous and violent and un-American. Um, and the Knights of Labor will certainly suffer the most from this, as their membership will drop from 800,000 to zero in a few years. Another proposed solution by some reformers is socialism, which was far more appealing to many Americans than we might think. Keep in mind, most of our modern opposition to socialism comes from the context of the Cold War. Um, this is long before that. So you have a laissez-faire capitalist society that is certainly not appearing to serve the needs of most of its poor. Socialism offers an alternative, and it's a very enticing one for many Americans. Um, so socialism proposes that the government should own and operate some business enterprises in order to more fairly distribute that wealth rather than letting things be produced or created simply for the profit of very few. Socialism was promoted in America by two books, well, a lot more than two, but two books in particular. One is called The Cooperative Commonwealth in 1867 by Lawrence Grundland, which is a very straightforward argument for why socialism would be superior to the capitalist system of the time. And then the other one's a little bit more entertaining. In 1887, this is called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, and it describes a socialist utopia set in the year 2000. And they kind of look back to, the 1887 and kind of laugh at the fact that how foolish were we that not everyone had a home and that people actually starved and that, you know, uh, all the wealth was owned by a handful of people and wasn't fairly distributed. How strange of us from back then. Um, but both of these are effective in convincing a lot more Americans than you would think that socialism was a good alternative to the system under which they were living. Stepping away from economic theory a little bit, we had religious reformers during the era too, and they had proposed things like the social gospel. The social gospel was the belief that Christians had a responsibility to confront social problems like poverty. It's mostly popular among Protestant denominations, but it stresses that to be a good Christian, you need to do good works. It's not enough to believe, you have to act on those beliefs, and you need to act on them in a way that promotes the social good. Uh, Dealing with social problems, poverty, homelessness, abuse of workers, and so on. If you've ever heard the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" This is actually where that originates. Finally, number five, how was the West transformed economically and socially in this period? Part of further economically integrating the country and industrializing it and crisscrossing it with railroads. Um, Part of that is the conquest of the American West, and it very much was conquest. This is a kind of internal empire building for the United States, and although our government claimed all of the land, we didn't control it. And the process of displacing, subjugating, Native Americans is part of a kind of an internal empire building and a kind of conquest. So Americans often idealized the West, and we still do really. Part of that was Frederick Jackson Turner's The Significance of the Frontier in American History. It was an influential thesis or argument, and it argued that the having a frontier was important because having a frontier is what was responsible for forging American qualities like individualism and democracy and economic mobility. And having a frontier also acted as a safety valve for social unrest, in his view. So he's arguing that disaffected people from the cities back east could move west, and that meant that they weren't staying back east and building up tension that would eventually boil over into rioting or strikes or something like that. So You have the significance of the frontier in American history further romanticize the West and also make it central to the success of America, central to the American identity. And the government tried to promote westward expansion, certainly. The Homestead Act, that was passed by the Republican Congress during the Civil War in 1863, encouraged westward expansion by handing out 160 acres of land for free if you would settle on it for 5 years and try to develop it. Um, they also passed at the same time the Land Grant College Act, also known as the Morrill Land Grant Act, to try to assist states in establishing agricultural and mechanical colleges to make sure that these individuals that were taking advantage of the Homestead Act had the skills and knowledge that they needed to be successful in developing this land over 5 years. But contrary to popular belief, the West wasn't really settled by small farmers because most of these homesteaders were not able to develop the land over 5 years. And a lot of the land ends up getting bought up by speculators and large agricultural companies. So the West is really settled by large scale commercial agriculture, like big farming corporations, really. You ended up with so-called bonanza farms that were farms that covered thousands of acres and employed large numbers of wage workers, very much like a factory system. And the heart of American agribusiness was California in producing plantations that made citrus fruits mostly. They relied on migrant wage labor in large estates, mostly Chinese and Mexican laborers. But again, these are poor working class laborers that, although they are working in fields, they are very much the equivalent of, industrial workers. Um, Cowboys, sort of characteristic of the West. Cowboys were characteristic of the West and important for a short time. Cowboys drove cattle herds across the open range from ranches in southern Texas to the railheads further north, places like Abilene, Cheyenne, Ogallala, where the railroads were. That way they could ship the stock either east or west. Cowboys were oftentimes diverse. They were oftentimes African American or Latino. And being a cowboy was actually a really good job for ethnic and racial minorities because they enjoyed a greater degree of autonomy, freedom, and even equality out on the range. Now, this era of the cowboy was, like I said, kind of short-lived. It ended in the mid 1880s after two terrible winters destroyed much of the livestock for a while, and the widespread use of barbed wire to divide up the open range made it harder to drive cattle that far. Importantly, Western lands are open for white settlement through the dispossession of Native American land, particularly that of the Plains Indians. And their way of life is destroyed by white American expansion in a number of ways. First is, of course, US military aggression and the violation of treaties with Native Americans. Congress actually eliminated the treaty system in 1871, which had been established long ago in the Indian Intercourse Act that said land had to be taken by way of concluding a treaty. Once we do away with that, we effectively have open conquest of Native American land. The Plains Indians' way of life is also destroyed by the destruction of their chief resource, the buffalo. The building of multiple transcontinental railroads, which only speeds up the rate of settlement and destruction of the buffalo. And certainly we have the confinement of tribes onto reservations where they were typically mistreated and undersupplied. Um, there was some violent resistance to white American expansion. Notably, George Custer's 7th Cavalry was defeated at the Little Bighorn in 1876 by an alliance of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. But such violent resistance only reinforced American stereotypes of Native Americans as warlike savages who are violent and barbaric, and hence just justified greater military aggression. Now, in the 1880s, though, we begin to see American government policy toward Native Americans shift, but not necessarily for the better. This begins with the publication of A Century of Dishonor by a reformer named Helen Hunt Jackson. It raised public awareness of the wrongs that the federal government had inflicted on Native Americans throughout American history, and she mailed a copy of it to every congressman, and thus this becomes very influential in changing Native American policy. But again, not necessarily for the better. The big result of this is going to be the Dawes Act, or the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. It was a, to say the least, misguided attempt to reform Native American policy. The goal here was to assimilate Native Americans into white American life. And assimilation always assumes the inferiority of one group to another, and in this case, that group is Native Americans. So in attempts to assimilate or make Native Americans effectively live like whites, they dissolved many tribes as legal entities and eliminated tribal ownership of land. They did this by granting 160 acres to individual family heads, very much like a homestead system. But uh, this actually ended up resulting in a 50% land loss for Native Americans. Most notoriously, the newly created Bureau of Indian Affairs created boarding schools where Native American children would be sent for forced assimilation. They would be forced to cut their hair, dress in white clothes, speak English, take on new names. So we see three boys here when they first arrive at one of these boarding schools, and this is shortly thereafter, where they are forced to assimilate. The intention, according to one reformer, was to kill the savage, save the man. And this amounts to cultural genocide ultimately. We lose an incalculable loss of Native American culture as entire generations are forced to forget their oral histories, their songs, their religions, their stories, and so on. Now, for some Native Americans, the ghost dance promised to bring solace to them. It was a sacred ritual that, if performed, it was believed would bring the buffalo back and make white civilization disappear. It's a very kind of apocalyptic, millenarian kind of response to the destruction of their way of life and their societies. Um, but reservation officials who witnessed it feared that it would lead to an uprising. They characteristically misinterpreted it as being a war dance. And this is ultimately going to lead to attempts to crack down and prevent the ghost dance. This will result in a group of Lakota Sioux trying to leave their reservation, where they will be stopped, surrounded by the U.S. Army, and slaughtered at the battle, or better known as the massacre at Wounded Knee. So the massacre at Wounded Knee happened in 1890. Uh, Reservation officials tried to arrest Sitting Bull. They believed him to be instigating the ghost dance, and they killed him in the attempt. And that led to other Sioux trying to flee the reservation to go back to their ancestral lands. They are intercepted and they are killed. The cause is disputed, but nonetheless, soldiers who are actually from the late Custer's 7th Cavalry killed as many as 200 Sioux, including men, women, children, the elderly, and so on. And after the massacre at Wounded Knee, large-scale Native American resistance to white Western expansion stops. And this is widely understood to mark the end of Native American resistance as well as their way of life. And it paves the way for further expansion, industrial development, and the uh, expansion of the Gilded Age.